Hi everybody, welcome back. This is September 27th. It is a Wednesday. Today we're going to finish up our Jim Crow discussions in class, looking at the final two aspects of the supporting of the main ideas and find supporting facts for them. But before we get to that, I know I started yesterday talking about the Jim Crow laws and the website from the Jim Crow. Today, for most of the classes, we finished up this website if you went to this ahead of time. So if you, this activity will try to go vote, and you keep entering forward. Now, in many of these cases, like I said, grandfather clause, we got the literacy test yesterday, and I had that on Canvas. We also went forward here, but as you look at all of these different categories, it asks you a question. Did you pass the test? Many people that was known, you go back to the start, and you go right back here again. All right? But what you need to do is when you go to enter, and keep continuing forward. Put yourselves in those positions. Yes, okay, you were able to have a grandfather clause, which you were able to prove, which many African Americans couldn't do at this point. Then you passed the literacy test. You showed remarkable test-taking aptitude, and you passed it. And then let's say you were able to pay the poll tax, which is something that many African Americans couldn't afford in the South at this point. You would continue onward. Then it's about transportation. And continue onward to the sheriff. Now, I went all this stuff yesterday, and you can read through it on your own, but there's a lot of other resources on the Rise and Fall of Jim Crow website through PBS, which can help you kind of understand the stories. Struggle for these, you can look at that and find different areas as to where U.S. Supreme Court cases for in the battle for civil rights, congressional efforts, when presidents had to fight their role for civil rights. What do we see here? What efforts are put forth? So I'm looking at all these different sections. It really gives you a good idea of how much effort was put into ending the struggle for the plight of African Americans in the South, which there was a lot of attention drawn towards it. Now, the rest of the class, what we did was we went over the rest of these other groups, looking at in the South, society was organized according to the Jim Crow system. Essentially, this is a way to keep African Americans feeling inferior. That's all Jim Crow is. Jim Crow, the person itself is a fictional character made up in the cartoons and the vaudeville shows and dramas of the time as a way to make fun of African Americans, find different ways that we can see the flaws within African Americans and then poke fun of them. That's what Jim Crow is all about. It's usually an actor, a white actor in blackface, who would try to replicate some of the the actions or just the tendencies of African Americans, and then accentuate them to where they're just really blown out of proportion. But that's what Jim Crow is all about. So they call these the Jim Crow laws. But we look at ways that African Americans are made inferior. First off was the separation of races, segregation. You're talking about public places, buses, bathrooms, water fountains. You're looking at airplane rides. You go into baseball games. People had to sit in different places. If you watch the movie 42, about Jackie Robinson, you can see where people have to sit in a different section of the stadium. You're looking at factory entrances. When people go into the factories, African Americans and white workers have to go into different entrances because of this system. It's just about making people feel inferior. Another thing that was done at this point under the Jim Crow system was about etiquette and other customs at the time that needed to be followed if you were an African American citizen. So, for instance, if you're walking down the street as an African American citizen and a white couple was coming by, you had to step aside and tip your cap to them, greeting them a good day, and then you may go about your business once they get past. And you need to keep doing this all the time. One of the stories we talk about where someone didn't do this and what happened to them is the story of Emmett Till. If you need further clarification of Emmett Till, you can go online and look up his story and see what it was, all about. But it's one of the big cases at the time that we see etiquette not being followed and what the results of that are. So can read that story and how the etiquette was not followed, and you can see what many African Americans had to be subjected to if they did not follow these customs and etiquette. But that was Jim Crow, like public spaces, other areas where people were intimidated to feeling inferior. One group that does also keep the Jim Crow system alive and well at this time is the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, showing their fiery crosses, showing the intimidation, using violence to make people feel inferior, or at least to keep people in their place. And then people had to ask themselves, especially those that were meant to feel inferior, like African Americans, is it worth the amount of hassle it's going to cost me and my family? How convicted am I into this idea? All right. When's enough? And that's what they have to ask. And that's what some of these groups counted on. We're going to harass you so much that you're not going to want to, attempt to protest, to attempt to make your life better. You're just going to take it as it is because it's the only way you can stay safe. The third part of this, African Americans responded to discrimination in several ways. A lot of them wanted to, after, the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment were passed, a lot of them wanted to go back to Africa. So they helped fundraise. They found different ways to raise money to make sure that African Americans were sent off, and found ships and passage across back to Africa. Other groups wanted to stay in America, which is their right as citizens now, according to the 13th and 14th Amendments, but they wanted to take their right to vote and practice their issues in the courts. Take their issues to the courts and take lawyers with them. Lawyers that aren't white, that are going to just, half-heartedly support them or half-heartedly defend him. You want to take lawyers and get lawyers involved that are going to support them fully, rightly, and to make sure all the wrongs, are righted to ensure that African Americans are treated fairly in this country. The NAACP is the first organization, and it still exists to this day, to defend African American rights. They do it early on through the courtrooms. They don't go fighting. They don't try punching their way away from this. No, they do it through the courts. They use a lawyer like Thurgood Marshall, who was the first African American Supreme Court justice. They use him to help him, to give him all the resources he needs to give people and bring attention to the Supreme Court how wrong life is in the South. So that's what this whole section is about, how they respond to it. So there's some evidence there if you want to continue looking through your book for those reasons. It's page 332, 333 for those areas. Now at the end of this, I had students for the rest of the class today take up a reflective writing assignment where they wrote down some of these answers. Now, if you were here a couple days and you want to write this down, that's fine. But I would like you to answer these questions. All right, so go back to these other videos, find the resources I gave you, fill them out, and then think about voting. Why is voting, a right that is taken for granted by so many, a very important right to the American people? Why is it important? Why is voting important? Why do we have to put ourselves in the shoes of women and African Americans to understand what their right to vote does for them? Why do we do that? So why is it important? So discuss it. Because Americans today take it for granted. All right? Next, why do you believe many in the U.S. at this time, this is the second prompt, why do you believe many in the U.S. at this time did not want women or African Americans to vote? Think from a statistical standpoint. What does voting allow people who now have the right for the first time? And what does that take away from those who already had that right? So use this perspective and think about why voting is important, and people are gaining stuff. Is anybody losing anything as a result of that? So think about those ideas and come to me with your best answer, and then bring this back to me as a brief little write-up that you can hand in for a quick homework grade. All right. So you can pause this, get these questions down, and give me what you believe is right about the right to vote, especially when it comes to women or African Americans, and do what you can. All right. Everyone have a great day. I will see you tomorrow. Tomorrow is back to school night, by the way.